All right, we're going to go through the process of making kombucha today. We'll look at both setting up the first ferment and the second ferment because I've already got a bottle that's done its first ferment. The SCOBY's in there. You'll have to figure out how to acquire a SCOBY if you're going to make kombucha yourself. I got mine from somebody else that was making kombucha. They will grow babies and you can separate them and put them into a separate batch so that you have your own. Kind of got everything out here that we're going to need. One of the first things you have to be cautious of when making kombucha is that the SCOBY doesn't come in contact with any antibacterial products because it is a bacterial culture and it does not cope well with being in contact with metal. So you should remove any rings or anything you have. If I can get mine off, just a second here. Okay, rings off. I'm maybe a little bit overly paranoid about using any dishcloths and towels because they might have antibacterial soap, so I tend to use paper towel through the process. First thing I usually like to do is get my water hot for brewing my tea. Kombucha is fermented tea. So we're going to, I like to use a really big pot, not because we are actually brewing that much tea, but it cools more quickly. My batches, I usually make a 4-liter batch or 4-gallon batch, approximately 4-gallon batch. But I only boil half my water to brew my tea in because then I can cool that down more quickly with the other half of the water to so I don't have to wait to add the SCOBY in after the fact. So I'm going to start by adding 2 liters of water. Normally I try to make sure that all the tools I'm going to use that I wash with just white vinegar first, again, just in case there's any antibacterial soap on them. So I'm just going to put some, again, I'm not sure if all this process is necessary. I usually wash my hands in it as well, make sure my hands are clean of any antibacterial soap because I did wash my hands beforehand. Kind of rinse everything off. I'll use this wooden spoon later, funnel, so you'll see how all these pieces get used later. And I'll also use the vinegar to wash out my bottles later. We'll come back to that later. Okay, so I'll rinse the vinegar off, not that it really matters. I'm getting cold water just from the tap. I am on well water here, and just from experience, I know it's all right for brewing the kombucha, but if you are in the city or on city water, I assume that the SCOBY would not like any chlorinated water, so you should be using bottled water. I started with bottled water, but then ran out, so I started using well water and had no issues. So I'm just going to put 2 liters in my large pot here and set it off to boil while I get the other parts of the process prepared. Okay, there's my 2 liters of water. I'm going to just put that on high and let it boil until it boils, and then we'll add our tea bags. But we'll come back to that. Okay, the other things that I'm going to need for the water once it boils, we'll put 8 tea bags in, so 8 tea bags for 4 liters of water. I'm just using King Cole because I find it makes pretty good tea. You know, you could go with an organic tea if that was of concern to you. So we'll come back to that. The SCOBY and the process needs again, I'm just going to wash the vinegar off these. The SCOBY and the fermentation process needs some sugar to kind of fuel the process. So I am using honey, and again, you could use organic honey if you were concerned about that. I'm using this Kirkland stuff from Costco because it's one of the more cost-effective means. So I'm just going to measure this out to be used later. So we'll put 1 cup of honey in the 4-liter batch. So I'm just going to measure that out, leave that there, and we'll come back. We're going to use the honey again later for getting the second ferment process going. Okay, like I said when we started, I had a first ferment already ready to be bottled for the second ferment. I put my first ferment supposed to be in a warm spot, so I keep it in the cupboard above my fridge where it stays probably a little bit warmer than room temperature. So this is my bottle that's been through that first ferment, which I use a first ferment of 7 days. So this has been sitting in there for 7 days. I use a coffee filter on the top to keep any fruit flies or any dirt or anything out of it while it still allows it to breathe. So just a coffee filter and an elastic. You'll note that my container is glass, my valve on it is plastic, so again, no metal in contact with my SCOBY. We're going to take the SCOBY out and set it aside for to put back into another first ferment. So I will just grab myself. I usually just use a glass measuring cup. Again, I'm just going to rinse this out. Again, I'm super paranoid about any antibacterial soaps and that killing my SCOBY. So I'm just going to rinse this. So I have a container that I'm going to put my SCOBY in. Again, my hands have been rinsed with vinegar. All my rings are off. I'm going to just reach in, grab the SCOBY. I'm going to pull it out. My SCOBY is quite large. I could probably split my SCOBY off to have a piece to provide somebody else. I often will peel the kind of waxy layer on the top off as it gets really big. None of that's really necessary, but no, I like to clean mine up every now and then. So again, it's not really necessary, I don't think, but it gets really big and kind of ugly otherwise. Okay, so I'm just going to save this part of the SCOBY for to put back in to do another ferment. This waxy layer I'm going to just throw out. It's kind of slimy. Just going to rinse that off. Again, notice I'm staying away from any antibacterial soap or dishcloths that might have antibacterial soap on them. I need to kickstart the fermentation process when I bring in a new batch of tea in with my SCOBY. I should carry over about a cup of the first ferment into my first ferment of a second batch. So I'm just going to take my measuring cup here. I've used my other measuring cup for my honey. I'm going to just wash this out with vinegar again. So 1 cup measuring cup. I'm going to, and this is important that you stir up the kombucha from the first ferment, just using a wooden spoon that I've cleaned with vinegar as well. It helps the second ferment process and helps with getting that fizziness to that kind of carbonated type reaction in your second ferment. Just stirs that bacteria and that around a bit, and said it helps the second ferment process. So I'm going to collect a cup of this. You'll notice I have a valve on this container, which makes it quite convenient for this process. I'm going to put that in there, and I'm going to save that. That's going to go in my next batch. So I'm just going to set this aside, and we'll use that to go into the next batch I make. Okay, so my water is now boiling. Once it comes to a boil, I can actually remove it from the heat. I grab 8 of my tea bags and throw them in to brew. One, two, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And I'll set my timer for 10 minutes just to let the tea brew for 10 minutes. Okay, so we'll come back to that when the time is expired, and remove the tea bags and add our honey, and then we'll look at how we can quickly cool it down by just adding some other water. Okay, so continuing on with our bottling the first ferment to start that second ferment. I like to use the flip top bottles for a 4-liter batch. 5 of these 750 milliliter flip top bottles are about the perfect size. I buy these ones from a local grocery store. They come with some carbonated fruity drink in them, which we pour out of them and then use the bottles, clean the bottles up and use these. So before we bottle anything in our bottles for our second ferment, again, I like to just make sure my bottles are clean. Again, I mean, I wash them with soap and water, but to make sure that any of that antibacterial soap is out of there, I like to put a little vinegar or vinegar and water in them. Notice I have a few different types of bottles here. I didn't have 5 of the 750 ml bottles today, so I've got one 1-liter bottle that I'm going to use. So I'll just put a little vinegar in each of these and swish it around, rinse them out, and I'll do that with each of my bottles. Okay, so I've got all my bottles rinsed out with vinegar after they having already been cleaned. Rinse them out with vinegar, rinse them again with some water, so they're nice and clean. Now I'll put in whatever I want for flavoring. You can have a look online. There's lots of different options of berries and the like that you might put in. My favorite, after trying many different things, is just ginger flavored. It's almost just like ginger ale. I generally use candied ginger. If you see the size of these chunks, I'll use about 4 chunks for a 750 milliliter bottle. I'll just break them up in strips and put them in the bottle. And again, put 4 chunks in. And this is what I've been doing all along. The candied ginger is very expensive. Buy it at the local bulk store, but again, very expensive. So what I'm going to try today, and I've heard it works well, is I'm just going to try some actual ginger root that's been peeled. I peeled it, cut it in strips, and stored it in my freezer. This was a suggestion of my mother, and this is how she's been doing it. So I've got 4 strips here I'm going to put in, but I'm also going to add a little bit of honey to, again, help feed that fermentation process, because I don't have the sugar that is on the typical candied ginger that I've been using. So I'm going to put in about a tablespoon of honey with the 4 strips of ginger root that I've put in there. We'll see how this turns out. Again, I haven't tried this for myself yet, but I did try some that was made this way, and it was excellent. So this should be a cheaper alternative to the candied ginger. Okay, so I've put my candied ginger, and today I'm going to experiment with a couple different kinds. So I've got my candied ginger in 3 of my bottles. I've put my strips of ginger root with about a tablespoon of honey in 2 of my other bottles. I'm actually done with the honey now. I find I get a much more fizziness to my kombucha if during the second ferment I add somewhere around a quarter of a cup of orange juice. Now this does make for a very fizzy bottle of kombucha. Makes it a bit challenging to open, as my daughter can attest to. So I'm just going to add a little bit of orange juice. Again, if you're concerned about being organic, you could probably find an organic version. And I'm actually not going to put quite a quarter cup because, like I said, it ends up being quite challenging to open the bottles without them exploding and spraying everywhere. So I'm going to go a little lighter on the orange juice, so it won't maybe feed that process quite as substantially. Okay, so I'm going to add a bit of orange juice to each of these. Again, the orange juice is kind of an optional step. I just started doing it. Find I get a little bit more aggressive second ferment, which results in a fizzier effect. And I mean, you could use any kind of fruit juice, or maybe even a little bit more honey to have the same effect. Okay, we see that our 10 minutes has gone by for our tea to brew. So now I'm just going to take and remove my tea bags. I just use a slotted spoon to take them out and discard them. Okay, now we have just tea. Okay, so brewed tea. Now this is every now and then I forget and put my water, my other 2 liters of water in before I put my honey, and the honey doesn't dissolve nearly as quickly. So if you put your honey in while the tea is still hot, you will dissolve your honey and it'll mix in much more easily. So my cup of honey, I just like to stir it around a bit to wash it out of my measuring cup. Again, I like to kind of stir that around a little bit. You can see honey still stuck a bit on the bottom. So I'll stir that around just a little bit more here. Okay, so my cup of honey is mixed in there pretty well. That honey that is going to be what feeds the SCOBY during our first ferment. With that done, I can now add the rest of my water. Again, if you aren't on well water or are concerned about the quality of your water, you could use bottled water. My well water works fine, so I'm just going to add 2 liters of water to this. Doesn't need to be extremely precise. Okay, and now I've got a total of 4 liters of brewed tea with a cup of honey in there. Okay, so and already right away that's cooled down. You want something that's around room temperature. I can test it just by touch and see. Yeah, it's cooled down. Probably okay, cool enough right now that I could add it back in my fermentation container and add the SCOBY to it without worrying about the temperature being too hot for the SCOBY. Okay, so bottles have either the candied ginger or the ginger root and honey, a little bit of orange juice or fruit juice of some kind. We can now top the bottles up with the fermented tea that has been fermented from the first ferment, the ferment that had the SCOBY in it. By the way, the length of the fermentation process is quite important. Just a day or two too long can make the tea very strong. It starts to go to vinegar and can make it quite unpleasant to drink. I find a good length of time is about 7 days for the first ferment. That may vary depending on the environmental conditions, the temperature of the room you store it in. But for me, I store it in our room temperature is generally around 22, 23 degrees Celsius, whatever that is in Fahrenheit. And again, 7 days works well for me. My second ferment, I like about 4 days, somewhere between 4 and 5 days works well. Okay, and after I bottle these, these will go in the cupboard again, sealed to ferment for what we call the second ferment. You'll note that before I started filling up this bottle, I stirred up the kombucha again. I'll do this a few times through the process to make sure that I kind of get the sediment that's on the bottom of the container mixed in. That makes for a much more effective fermentation on the second ferment and gives a much better fizziness to the kombucha. Okay, so I like to fill them up to 2.5 inches from the top of the bottle, so we get a good strong lots of pressure in the bottle when you open it. Again, can make it a bit challenging to open, so I'll warn you. But said if you leave it too low, you won't get quite as much pressure build up, and it might not be quite as carbonated seeming. So again, we'll just and I often like to give the kombucha another stir between each bottle, and we'll set it to fill another bottle here. All right, got all 5 bottles filled. I actually ran a bit short today because I didn't have a fifth 750 milliliter bottle. This one I didn't quite get filled, and I usually don't like to use the kombucha from the first ferment down that low. It tends to have quite a bit of sediment in that last little bit, which some people are a little turned off by when it comes time to drink it, if you get some of that sediment in your bottle. I like to use just a little filter as I pour it in my glass to drink, and that filter out anything that might be in the bottle. Okay, so from there, we just take these bottles. I like to clean the tops off a bit, wipe my bottles down, and we seal them. Okay, and with all my bottles sealed and cleaned up, I start the second fermentation process by again putting them in a warm, dark place for, again, my case I like 4 days. I have done 5 days, it's okay too, but I find 4 days kind of my preference. So we'll put them there, and in 4 or 5 days, however much you prefer, you transfer them into the fridge. Once they get cold, that stops the fermentation process, and you can store them for an extended length of time in the fridge. Okay, I have a first ferment, my jar for my first ferment that I just emptied as I prepared a second ferment that you'll see later. But I need to clean this up to prepare it for my new batch. So I usually have, again, a little bit more than this left in the bottom of my jar. I used one bottle that was a little too large today. So I'll just take this to the sink, dump out any excess. I'll rinse out my container. Again, remembering that my container is glass with a plastic valve, no metal. I'll put a little vinegar in this as a cleaning agent. Use some paper towel rather than a cloth, which may or may not have any antibacterial soap. Add a little water to that, and I will clean out the jar. And my jar is ready for another starting the process over again, starting a first ferment over again. Okay, so with my brewed tea all ready, and my extra water, my honey added, dissolved in there, and then my extra water to cool down that those 4 liters of brewed tea, and with my fermentation bottle ready from my last batch, I can transfer my SCOBY back into the bottle. Again, note my hands have been cleaned of any disinfectant soap. I've rinsed them in vinegar, taking my rings off so that I can safely handle the SCOBY. I'll put the SCOBY back into my fermentation bottle. I'll add a cup of my kombucha, my fermented tea from the last first ferment that I did, and I will simply add the brewed tea and honey, which again I made sure has cooled down sufficiently. You're looking for it to be somewhere around room temperature, so this has cooled down enough. I'll add that to my fermentation jar with my SCOBY. And we have another batch ready to go through the first fermentation stage, which I like to have go for about 7 days. Wipe down my container, particularly around the lip of the container, where I'm going to seal it or cover it. I just use a coffee filter, find it works well. It's an inexpensive solution that keeps any fruit flies and any other contaminants out of the kombucha. Just put an elastic around there to hold it in place. And with that done, I put it in a warm place to ferment for 7 days. In my case, that's the cupboard above my fridge where it's warm and dark. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, in order to stop the second ferment after 4 or 5 days, whatever is to your liking, we will take our bottles, I'll transfer them into the fridge to stop that fermentation process. I've in fact got some in here that have already been through the second ferment and are cold. I'll just show you what you can expect when you go to open these. My product tends to be quite under quite a lot of pressure, so it's a bit tricky to open them. I'm actually going to get myself a glass here to pour this off in. Said some people like it filtered, so notice very high pressure that I have to be very cautious when I open it. Open it very slowly. And there's our kombucha. See, it's very fizzy. Had a few chunks of the candied ginger come out. Again, having the screen helps you remove any of your flavoring product and not get in your drink. And there we are.